Today is 17th of August 2045. Exactly 1 century Indonesia celebrating its independence. A very large archipelago country. Even the accurate number of islands has only been known for the last quarter century. Now this country with 17,499 islands can enjoy true independence and prosperity. A prosperity that is evenly distributed throughout the country, even to the smallest, most remote and most isolated islands. But this did not happen suddenly, nor easily. Until the three-quarters century of its independence, Indonesia had only succeeded in advancing a fraction of the number of its islands, namely only a dozen large islands. One of the main obstacles is energy. Initially the country was an oil exporter, but after half a century of its life, the oil produced was no longer sufficient to meet its own domestic needs. At the age of three-quarters of its century, in 2020, about half of the country's oil needs need to be imported. The problem is, no matter how low the world oil price falls, the price of fuel for this archipelago country is difficult to come down. Distribution costs are so expensive to reach islands that are scattered far away, making fuel subsidies a very heavy burden for the state. Coal is owned in abundance in this country. It will even be sufficient for the next few decades. However, the problem is the same, namely the high cost of transportation of fuel to transport it to power generation centers, which generally only exist on the big islands. Small islands generally supply diesel fuel generators, half of which must be imported and shipped at very high cost to remote parts of the country. Exactly at the age of three-quarters of a century in Indonesia, it coincided with a very terrible global pandemic in the era of super-modern civilization, originally from China but in a span of less than 1 year. Almost no country in the world was free from the deadly virus which was then called COVID-19. This incident is a lesson in itself because the life of Indonesian people who live on beautiful small islands. They are almost untouched by the global pandemic. The low activity and interaction of the islanders with the outside community has kept them safe from this highly contagious pandemic. Even though life on the islands of the archipelago was safe from the terrible global pandemic, the majority of urban people at that time were not immediately moved to further empower the life of these small, safe islands. The main obstacle is energy, which has been described previously. It is a visionary startup company that was born a few years before the pandemic, namely AfterOil Indonesia, which even before the pandemic had thought that Indonesia's future was in these small islands of tens of thousands. During the pandemic, AfterOil has also designed and started producing the first models of microscale power plants, which use gasification technology, microturbine, Stirling engine and so on. AfterOil Indonesia had realized long before the pandemic that to effectively process the potential of these tens of thousands of islands, local resources were needed, mainly to fulfill two basic needs, namely food and energy. If these two things can be done first, the archipelago economy will skyrocket because there is a food economy and an energy economy, the two biggest basic needs of society, which boost local income, create jobs and generate investment. The Local Food and Local Fuels program was what was relied on at that time to be the engine of growth in the islands. Local foods is raised with divine food, which is easily accepted by the local community because the average is in line with the beliefs of the majority of the local population. The program relies on less dependence on grains, less meat and other livestock products, while most or three-quarters of the diet comes from fruit, vegetables and spices. The three of them are easily planted in almost all the islands in Indonesia, which on average have so much of their respective biodiversification rich. The local fuels that are always available throughout the tens of thousands of islands are biomass, with microturbines initiated and produced by the AfterOil ecosystem. Small-scale power plants and biomass fueled easily spread throughout the islands. The ease of energy production based on local resources is the stepping stone for the next development of this archipelago country. The peak is when the country's oil reserves run out in 2030. The AfterOil ecosystem has been able to capture CO2 emissions and turn it into long-chain hydrocarbon fuel, which previously relied on fossil fuels in the form of oil, most of which had to be imported. The ability to process CO2 effectively for fuel complements the use of CO2 from the capture of carbon emissions, which was originally only for growing microalgae plants, then for the production of carbon nanomaterials and finally for hydrocarbon fuels that replace oil. The almost perfect circular economy that we enjoy in this century-old Indonesia cannot be separated from the futuristic thoughts of experts who are struggling to survive the terrible pandemic a quarter of a century ago. Today 17th of August 2045 we are grateful and celebrate our true independence.